My name is Gloris, and I'm 25 years old. My job as a programmer sounds cool to most people, but honestly, it's just long hours at the computer, hunting down bugs and writing meaningless lines of code that no one seems to care about. That Tuesday, as I was returning home after one of those endless days of fixing someone else's ill-conceived bugs, my head was aching so badly it felt like it would explode from the strain. All I could think about was eating something hot and just collapsing into bed, unplugging for at least a couple of hours, forgetting everything. When I entered the house, I barely had time to kick off my shoes at the door before heading straight to the bathroom to wash my hands. They were covered in all that endless code and the burned-out nerves I'd been dealing with all day. The house smelled of stew, and I felt my stomach rumble with hunger. Mom's stew is always my go-to after work, and I could also feel how, despite the noise and endless conversations, a certain peace reigned at home again. And so I entered the dining room and plopped down at my usual place at the table. Dad was already there with my younger sisters, Sarah and Hannah. Sarah, who had always been smart and sensible, was looking through something on her tablet, and Hannah, as always, was chattering incessantly, trying to keep up with our conversations. I didn't even have the strength to greet them. I simply lowered my gaze and began piling food onto my plate. And then Mom cleared her throat. You know, that special preparation before an important announcement. When she does that, I always sense there's something coming up that I really don't want to hear. Standing by the stove, Mom looked expectantly at us all, then at me, and said in an even voice, "I have an important announcement that concerns everyone, especially you, Gloris." My stomach immediately went cold. I glanced at Dad. He was sitting silently, his hands folded on the table. His face was what I would call calm, as if before a storm. Sarah, who always strove to keep her composure, barely managed to keep a smile from creeping onto her lips. And Hannah, the youngest, began quietly teasing me, knowing that laughing at the wrong time was her specialty. I don't know why, but I was overcome with anxiety. I expected the worst. And of course, I guessed right. Mom said again, "We sold the house. We're moving out tomorrow." I froze, unsure what to make of it. The fork in my hand made a brief thud, landing on my plate. I tried to look as shocked as possible, but I still couldn't hide the confusion and fear that suddenly washed over me. What? When did you decide this? Why didn't anyone tell me? My voice had that note when you can't believe what's happening, as if reality itself had contradicted your expectations. "We're not taking you with us," Mom said with a cold smile that I could hardly call sincere. It was as if she didn't see that it was like a punch to my chest, as if my feelings didn't matter. Dad intervened, as if he'd rehearsed his role in this scene, which everyone had apparently carefully prepared. "You have exactly 1 month to find a new place and move out before the new tenants arrive," he said, returning to his plate without any emotion. I felt my stomach clench, and my breathing suddenly became ragged. All I could do was sit there, trying to figure out how I'd ended up in this situation, in this house, with these people. But I couldn't say anything. I just sat there and tried not to let on that I was churning inside. There was this white noise all around me. Dad, as always, trying to convey his moral lessons, my sisters laughing, oblivious to anything important in my reaction. New tenants, some group. Mom shrugged. Hannah, unable to contain her laughter, nearly fell out of her chair, imagining me on the street with my computer, like some homeless person with a laptop. I was ready to say something harsh, to object, to put everyone in their place, but instead I simply said quietly, "It's not funny." My voice was weak. Even I felt every letter shake. All my thoughts were a jumbled mess, and I couldn't understand why this was happening to me, why it was me, of all people, who didn't fit into their worldview. Dad leaned back in his chair as if summing up the conversation, and added coldly, "Crying won't help you now, Gloris. You should work harder, at least to earn enough to rent an apartment." There was no trace of sympathy or pity in his words, only a dry statement of fact. I couldn't respond. I couldn't find the words. I simply sat there, staring at my plate, trying not to show how hurt I was. And so it went on. They talked about moving as if I didn't exist, as if I were invisible. All the decisions had been made, and I had no say. When they finished dinner and continued their conversation, I barely whispered that I was tired and went upstairs to my room. As soon as I closed the door to my room, I couldn't hold back any longer. I threw myself face first onto the bed and buried my face in the pillow. Not because I was crying, but because I was trying to suppress the laughter that seemed to be my only reaction to what had just happened. My entire body trembled with the effort not to laugh out loud. I knew if they heard that laughter, everything would be ruined and my mask of restraint would collapse like a house of cards. But the truth is, I already knew all this. I'd known about the house being sold for 2 whole months. And no, I wasn't mistaken. I really did know, because I was the one who bought it. Well, technically, my company bought it, but for me, it made no difference. My parents, of course, had no idea that their own daughter was the very company to which they'd just sold their house. The moment they announced it, I sat at the table, huddled over my plate, my insides awash with mixed emotions, from bewilderment to schadenfreude. How I loved that moment, how I laughed inside. To understand why I thought it all was so perfect, I need to go back a bit. Life in our family had never been easy, and everything I experienced began with my parents making no secret of the fact that they loved my sisters more than me. There was no violence or anything like that. They never hit me or left me without food or shelter. But the favoritism was obvious. It pierced my entire life like a cold knife. Sarah was always the center of attention, and I was somewhere on the periphery. When Sarah turned 16, they threw her a huge party with friends, a professional DJ, tons of gifts, and sweet nothings. When I turned 16, all I got was a cake from the local grocery store and a few words, "Happy birthday," while they continued watching TV. I remember sitting at the table and trying not to cry, but I couldn't. I just couldn't fool myself. Sarah got a brand new car for her 18th birthday. I got $20 and a card that said, "Congratulations on your high school graduation." I could never understand why this happened, why I was always left out in the cold. Every summer when they took Sarah and Hannah to the beach or to visit relatives, I was told that someone had to stay home to watch the house. I could never understand why I had to stay, as if I wasn't supposed to have fun. Christmas became a nightmare. They carefully arranged presents under the tree for Sarah and Hannah, while I sat off to the side, buying myself something practical, socks or school supplies, since that's what I was supposed to get. When I was 15, I started working after school at a local grocery store because I was tired of asking my parents for money and being turned down. With my first paychecks, I bought a used laptop from a pawn shop and started learning how to code. I took free courses, and honestly, I loved it. I began to realize that this was my thing and that I wanted to do this for the rest of my life. I worked like crazy, and by the time I graduated, I had enough skills to make programming my career. I applied to several colleges, and I was accepted to all of them. Several expensive private universities offered me partial scholarships, but I got a full scholarship at a public university, and that was a godsend. When I told my parents I'd been accepted to college, their reaction was rather muted, as if it were just another, "Oh, well, fine." And when I mentioned I needed money for colleges that didn't cover the full cost, my dad didn't even look up from his meal. "We're not paying for your college, Gloris. We're saving for Sarah and Hannah." I knew he'd say that, and to avoid further disappointment, I simply nodded and said I'd choose the public one, since it was still a good program. After all, it was free, and that kind of thing isn't easy to find. During college, I continued to work and live at home. In my sophomore year, I met Jake, a guy from my programming class. We started working together on projects, developing programs and apps we could sell. We split the money, and oddly enough, I started earning more than my dad, who worked at a hardware store. But the strangest thing about it was that I never told my family about my successes. With each passing month, I earned more and more, and they had no idea that their daughter, whom they had so little appreciated, was now a fully independent person, capable of providing for herself and her own life. I was building my career, and they still lived in a world where I was an insignificant and unimportant figure, and all their love and attention continued to go to Sarah and Hannah. I continued to wear the same old clothes, drive my beat-up Honda Civic, and act like I was barely getting by, even though I could have afforded a completely different life long ago. But no, I remained in the shadows, as always, trying to stay out of the spotlight, pretending that all those years in college I hadn't had it all that great. In my own house, I was almost invisible, like the air no one breathes until it's gone. My parents took Sarah and Hannah on family vacations to Florida or California, posting photos on Facebook of them looking so happy on beaches and at amusement parks. I stayed home, ostensibly to look after the house, when in reality they just didn't want me there, and that feeling was worse than any physical blow. My birthdays were a nightmare. When my day came, I'd wake up and no one would even remember. Years passed, and this situation didn't change. Sarah and Hannah always threw grand celebrations with friends, decorations, and expensive gifts, while I woke up with one thought: this will be another day like all the others. By evening, when I'd already realized the whole day had been a waste of time, I'd buy myself a small cake at the grocery store, and only then would they remember it was my birthday, and quietly, with barely sincere regret, mutter, "Oh yes, happy birthday." It was terribly painful. For 4 years, I lived like this, as if trying to prove to myself and everyone around me that I could cope, that I could be independent and strong. I went to classes, came home, worked on projects with Jake in my room, hiding the fact that in reality, he and I were far from poor. We were making a decent living selling our software, even though it was just a small business. We created a few inventory management programs, simple accounting systems. Nothing revolutionary, but at the time, it was a major achievement for us, and we were getting paid for it. With the money I was earning from these projects, I could have afforded almost anything. But of course, I continued to play the poor girl who was barely making ends meet, because it was easier than revealing to my family that I might have already strayed far beyond the role I'd been forced into. When I turned 22, I graduated from college, and as I'd become accustomed to, none of my family came to the ceremony. Sarah had a volleyball tournament that day, and my parents said that was much more important. I certainly didn't expect them to support me, but deep down, I hoped that at least someday it would happen. Jake's family, who had always been there for me, invited me to join them to celebrate my graduation. And while it was nice, I still couldn't shake the feeling that my own parents had simply forgotten about me, as if I were an unimportant part of their lives. A few days after graduation, my mom, clearly annoyed, cornered me in the kitchen and told me that now that I'd graduated, I needed to start paying rent. $800 a month starting next week. I simply nodded, showing no emotion, and replied, "Okay." $800 was a ridiculous amount for me, since I earned so much more. But of course, they weren't supposed to know that. My mom added that I needed to start buying my own groceries, which she thought would be fine because they weren't a charity. I just chuckled to myself, not even trying to argue. After all, I knew I shouldn't show them how successful I was. They didn't know that Jake and I were actually working on something much more ambitious during my final months of college. We'd spent our entire savings starting our own software company. We rented a small, cheap office with 2 desks and terrible lighting, but it had decent internet, and that was enough. We lived on noodles and energy drinks for months, pouring every dollar we earned into the business, and our lives were reduced to night shifts and a struggle to survive. Jake's girlfriend thought we were crazy, and my family simply thought I was broke because I continued to wear old clothes and drive my beat-up Honda Civic. But then, when I turned 24, that's what happened. It took us 2 years to develop our supply chain management software, and frankly, we no longer believed it would work. We were exhausted, broke, and largely doubted our product would ever make it to market. But then everything changed. A major logistics company heard about our software through word of mouth, tested it, and offered to buy it. When Jake told me the price, I thought he was joking at first. $2.3 million, he said, pointing to his laptop screen. I made him show me the email 3 times before I believed it. It was unbelievable. $2.3 million, money that could change my life forever, and all thanks to my efforts and my determination to persevere, no matter what. We went from eating instant noodles every day to becoming millionaires overnight. Well, we split the money 50-50, of course, but honestly, I couldn't have imagined such a thing was possible. For the first few minutes, I just sat and stared at the screen, not believing it was real, not believing that such numbers had suddenly appeared in our bank account. All this time, Jake and I had been counting every dollar, worrying about spending too much. And now, when the money from the software sales arrived, I felt all the fatigue I'd been harboring begin to evaporate like steam from a boiler. We'd earned more than I could have ever imagined, and it all happened so unexpectedly that it still didn't seem entirely real. The craziest thing began literally right after our success spread across the industry like wildfire. It turned out we'd created something truly worthwhile. Word of our program quickly spread to other software companies, and suddenly, each one wanted to work with us, sending in proposals for individual projects. The money we started receiving from these new contracts was simply astronomical, sometimes more than my father earned in an entire year. But despite all this, I still drove my old car, wore the same clothes, and lived in my childhood bedroom, paying my parents the same $800 rent they'd asked me for in the first place. Everything was so familiar that sometimes I felt like nothing had changed, like I was still living by their rules, even though I had over $3 million in my accounts. The funniest thing was when I found out my parents had decided to sell their house. 2 months before it all happened, I decided it was time for a change, that it was time to finally move out and buy my own place. I started looking for properties and stumbled across a familiar ad. Our house was for sale, and photos of every room, including mine, were posted online. My things, my closet, my chair, the very same desk where I used to do my homework. I just froze. My heart sank, and the thought flashed through my mind. They sold the house without telling me, without even warning me. At first, I was overcome with pain. It was so humiliating that I didn't want to believe it. But within seconds, that pain turned to rage. I felt betrayed like never before, and in that moment it became clear to me that I had an opportunity to get revenge, not harshly or spitefully, but in a way that would make them feel at least a little of the emptiness I'd felt all this time. I called Jake. I told him what was happening and said I was going to buy the house. He paused. "Are you sure?" he asked. I said yes, I'd do it through our company. They'd never know I was the buyer. Jake wasn't sure it was a brilliant idea, but he couldn't say it was crazy either. It must have seemed like a monstrous risk to him, but he trusted me. And I, in turn, decided I'd do the right thing. I hired a real estate agent and assigned him to handle the negotiations on behalf of our software company. It never occurred to my parents that the buyer was someone from their family. They thought it was some random company looking to buy the house as an investment property. We negotiated for 6 weeks, and all the while they were making plans for the move. Sarah dreamed of moving closer to her college. Hannah was thrilled with the idea of getting a bigger room in the new house. They didn't know that, in reality, their new home would be me. And I sat at the dining room table and listened to their conversations, nodding, pretending I had no idea what was happening to me. Inside, I burst into laughter, but I held it in because I needed to keep everything secret. It's funny, but just as they were unpacking and discussing what they would do after selling the house, I overheard a conversation in the hallway. It was so stupid, so offensive, that they thought I didn't even notice. "I'm almost ashamed I didn't tell Gloris," Mom said. "She'll be shocked." Dad replied, "Maybe it will motivate her to do something. Maybe she'll start achieving something." I literally had to bite the pillow to keep from laughing. If only they knew their useless daughter was going to buy this house right out from under their noses and become its owner. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a truck roaring outside. I looked out my bedroom window and saw my parents loading their suitcases into the car and the movers carrying boxes and furniture out of the house. It was like a movie. I just stood there and watched. They were moving everything except what was in my room and the basic kitchen appliances. The moment I stood there, everything seemed so obvious that I almost couldn't believe I hadn't realized I would be the one running their lives from now on. I got dressed and went downstairs, feeling a quiet tug and tighten in my chest, not from excitement, but rather from a strange sense of victory that still held a bitter edge, even if I tried to hide it from myself. Mom stood in the now nearly empty living room, checking off her list of what remained to be packed, and as soon as she saw me, her face broke into that same fake, sweet smile she usually gave me in moments when she couldn't just breathe and be honest. "Well, Gloris, that's it," she said, walking up to me and standing right in front of me. Her words sounded as if she expected me to burst into tears or run after her, begging her to stay, but instead I simply looked her calmly in the eyes. "We're leaving. Do you understand? You have exactly 1 month until the new owners arrive, and I suggest you start looking for an apartment today." I did my best not to show any nervousness, if there was any. My face was frozen like stone. I tried to portray the saddest and most worried expression possible, to somehow convey that it affected me. Sarah passed by carrying her last bag and couldn't resist glancing at me, and her voice, mixed with the way she was barely holding back a laugh, pierced the air. "Good luck finding a place you can actually afford on your salary. Maybe you can find a good cardboard box somewhere." Hannah didn't stay silent either, giggling as she added, "Or she could live in her car." I felt anger burn through me, but outwardly I remained stone cold, as if none of this concerned me. Their cruel jokes, their arrogance, it was all part of their usual game, one in which I always lost. But there was no point in proving anything now, because I knew things would be different. "Oh, wait," Hannah continued. "That piece of junk probably won't even start half the time." I couldn't take it anymore, but I simply remained silent. Dad came in from outside and looked around the empty room, where almost nothing remained, only their personal belongings and a few items they'd decided to take with them. The movers finished their work and left. Dad looked at me as if he were ready for the next stage of life, and I, standing by the window, couldn't believe how all this was happening. Not a single one of them looked back, even glanced at the house, or tried to comprehend what it meant to them as I stood there, watching them go. "Let's go," he said, and they left, leaving me alone. As soon as they were gone, I stood in the room, feeling the space around me become empty, as everything that had once been mine simply vanished. I quickly pulled out my phone and dialed Jake's number. "They're gone," I said when he picked up. He paused for a second, then said, "Bring beer and pizza. We're celebrating." An hour later, he showed up with a case of beer and 2 large pizzas, and we sat on the floor of the empty living room, eating pizza straight from the box and drinking beer, as if the whole thing were some kind of dream we had yet to fully comprehend. Jake was still shaking his head, his expression somewhere between astonishment and admiration. "I still can't believe you actually did that," he said, unable to comprehend how it was possible. "Your parents sold you their house and don't even know it," he added, and I felt a slight, almost elusive pleasure at the thought. "The best part is, they think some random company will kick me out in a month," I said with a grin, taking a long sip of beer. "They have no idea I own this place now." Jake laughed, looking at me with undisguised admiration. "You're completely cunning," he said, but his eyes glittered. "Remind me never to get into your bad situations." We spent the whole day planning what I wanted to do with the house. Honestly, I didn't want to change anything. This house was a part of my life, a part of memories that now needed to be preserved, albeit with some changes. Of course, I needed to get rid of the feeling of emptiness that remained after they left, so I decided it would be right to buy some new furniture. I went shopping for the first time in my life without worrying about money. I bought a huge sectional sofa, a big screen TV, a dining set, new appliances for the kitchen, and even a coffee machine that brewed perfect espresso. Everything fell into place, and the house, which had seemed empty and alien, began to fill with new meaning. 6 months passed, and I gradually settled into my new life as a homeowner. Jake and I continued working on new projects, earning more and more money, and even had to hire 2 more programmers to keep up with the workload. We moved into a larger office, and most importantly, all those painful moments from the past disappeared. There was no longer criticism, no constant pressure, no feeling that my sisters always got everything while I was left in the shadows. I was free. When I turned 26, I decided it was time to throw myself a real party. Nothing fancy, just a few friends, Jake, his girlfriend, and a couple of guys from work. We ordered way too much food, played games, and simply enjoyed the moment, which felt so real and genuine. We could celebrate not because we had something special, but because, in that moment, we felt like it was exactly what we deserved. It was my first birthday in years, and I honestly didn't expect anyone to remember since my parents and sisters didn't call or text me, as they always did. In the past, they'd never asked how I spent my birthdays, and I had no reason to think this time would be any different. And so it was. I got up in the morning, made myself a cup of coffee, and went about my life, focusing on what was in front of me, not on what I wasn't getting from others. There were no surprises or birthday cakes that day, just a strange sense of lightness, as if I'd finally learned to let go of the past. About a week later, while I was at work, I felt my phone vibrate on my desk, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw it was my mom calling. I almost didn't want to answer since, frankly, I didn't know what to say to her after everything that had happened. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up the phone anyway. "Hi," I said, trying to sound neutral, almost bored. "Gloris, what's going on?" Mom's voice was sharp and angry, as it always was when something was bothering her. "Mrs. Peterson from next door called me yesterday. She said you're still living in our old house. She said she saw the new furniture being delivered, and that your car is still parked in the driveway every night. Is that true? Haven't you left yet?" I heard Mom sigh heavily, and something inside me twisted angrily, but I tried not to show it. "Mrs. Peterson was the noisiest neighbor on the block," I said, unable to suppress a grin. "She spends most of the day sitting by the window, keeping an eye on everything that goes on around her." Mom continued to insist, and I could feel her voice growing increasingly irritated. "Don't you understand? You shouldn't be allowed to live there. The new owner should have moved in long ago. Why didn't you tell me anything? Weren't you planning on leaving?" I held back my laughter right away, but when it came time to answer, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Mom," I said calmly, "I'm the new owner. My company bought this house. I bought my own house from you." There was complete silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear her brain trying to process what I'd just told her. Mom was silent for a long moment, and I expected her to say something like, "That can't be right." But instead, she exhaled sharply and shouted, "That's impossible. You couldn't. You don't have that kind of money. You're just a programmer, barely making enough money to pay the rent." I felt something go cold in my chest, but I answered in a calm, confident voice, "Actually, I'm a millionaire, Mom. I own a software company." There was silence again. I heard her trying to find the words to refute me, but she couldn't. And then her voice exploded. "Are you kidding? How could you let us sell you the house without even saying anything? You let us think you'd be homeless? Why didn't you tell us you had money? Why?" With each question, her voice grew higher and more hysterical, and I had to move the phone away from my ear to keep from hearing her screams. "Mom, I didn't tell you because you abandoned me," I said, feeling the words escaping me. "You sold the house and left me there like a piece of old furniture you didn't want to deal with. You made it clear that I'm no longer part of your family, so I don't owe you any explanation." She started to say something in response, but I interrupted her. "No, you can't just write us off. We're your family." I paused, and my voice grew even colder. "No, that's not true. Not anymore. You made that choice when you decided I wasn't worthy of being with you. I'm no longer a part of your life. That's your choice." I fell silent, not wanting to continue this conversation. It was important for her to understand that I was no longer her child, someone who had to live up to her expectations. I took a step back, adding, "I have to get back to work. Don't call me anymore." I didn't wait for her answer and simply hung up, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. But I knew it wasn't over, that they would return. I was prepared for what was to come. And so, as I expected, at that Saturday morning hour when the sun's rays were just beginning to warm the earth, I heard someone pull up to my house. Glancing out the window, I saw my parents' car, from which all four of them, Dad, Mom, Sarah, and Hannah, were getting out. Their faces were tense, and they seemed almost unrecognizable standing on the porch of my house, which was now mine. I opened the door and saw them standing there, as if they weren't my parents, but strangers to whom I owed respect. "Come in," I said, stepping aside and backing away so they could pass. They walked into the living room, and I felt their faces change as they took in everything I'd purchased and installed. The enormous sectional sofa, the massive wall-mounted TV, the expensive coffee table, everything was top-notch. I saw them looking at it with surprise and perhaps a hint of envy, which I thought was evident even through their worried expressions. I remained silent, knowing that every glance they cast at this furniture wasn't just examining it, they were examining what I could now afford. Hannah literally couldn't tear her eyes away from it all. She stood there with her mouth open, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Sarah, like her younger sister, couldn't hide her surprise. Her eyes seemed to be trying to comprehend what was happening here, as if it weren't reality, but some kind of nightmare they were trying to comprehend. Dad muttered under his breath, his voice a mixture of bewilderment and annoyance, as if he had suddenly found himself on an alien planet. Jesus Christ! That thing must have cost a fortune. Mom, as usual, was trying to figure out the situation, but her face was so tense that I thought she was about to burst with the desire to find an explanation. "Gloris," she said through clenched teeth, but still trying to maintain her composure, "explain this to me. Where exactly did you get the money for all this and for this house?" I shrugged, as if it were perfectly obvious, and sat comfortably on my new sofa, which now seemed to me a symbol of the independence I'd been trying so hard to achieve. "I told you on the phone," I replied, taking my time. "I own a software company. I've been making good money for several years now." Sarah, who had been silent until then, finally turned her head and looked at me questioningly. "How much?" She still couldn't tear her eyes away from the TV, as if she hadn't noticed that her question was more important than anything else. I leaned forward slightly, as if emphasizing the significance of my answer, and said calmly, "Actually, my company is now worth over $3 million. At that moment, they all turned pale. Mom clutched the back of her chair, trying to maintain her balance as if she had to physically prop up her own reality, which was now crumbling. Dad turned white as a sheet, his lips barely moving as he quietly repeated, "3 million. That's impossible," Mom almost screamed. I could feel her trying to find some kind of justification for what I'd just said, but it seemed her mind refused to accept it as truth. "It's entirely possible, Jake," I said, watching her expression. "I started a company back in college. We sold our first major program for over $2 million, and it's only been growing since then." Hannah couldn't take it anymore and suddenly shouted, "If you have that much money, you have to help us. I need a new phone and I need a car. I can't live with this old... What the..." Dad, though trying to sound authoritative, couldn't contain himself. "Hannah, calm down." His voice was stern, but there was uncertainty in it, as if he didn't know what to expect from me. "You need to stay calm." But I saw something different in his eyes. His gaze was full of something I'd never seen before. Maybe something like envy, or even fear. I stood motionless, simply watching as they began to gather their thoughts. Mom tried to speak again. "Gloris, we need to have a serious talk." Her voice became quiet, almost pleading. "We've been having financial difficulties lately." The new house turned out to be more expensive than we expected, and Sarah's college tuition is due next month. We don't have enough money to cover this. I felt it all sounded like the same old rehearsed phrases I'd heard many times before, and now they sounded like pathetic attempts to return me to the role I was supposed to fulfill. "We need you to give us some money," Mom continued. "It's the right thing to do because we're your family." I looked at them, at my parents, who sold me this house, at my sisters, who seemed to think I now owed them for their senseless claims. And in that moment, I felt an incredible sense of irony wash over the whole scene. Everything I'd been through, everything I'd endured in my attempts to escape their power, now they came to me with open arms as if nothing had happened. I couldn't understand how they could be so blind, so unaware. "Let me clarify the situation," I said slowly, containing my irritation. "You sold this house. leaving me here like I was just another piece of furniture you didn't want to mess with. You told me I had a month to move out before the new owners kicked me out. You laughed when Hannah said I'd be living under a bridge. Mom tried to speak again, but I interrupted her. And now you want me to give you money? Her lips twitched, and she fell silent again. Dad, who was standing next to me, seemed at a loss for words. His face was pale, and his words sounded unconvincing. We didn't know you had money then. I couldn't take it anymore. If you'd known you were taking me with you, you would have definitely treated me differently. You really would have acted like I was your daughter. I exhaled, as if my own words had burned me. But you didn't. You just took your money and continued treating me like trash. Dad tried to object, but something in his voice didn't sound confident. That's not true. Really? Because for the last 10 years, you've made it clear that Sarah and Hannah are the most important, and I'm just a nobody. You took them on vacations and left me at home. You celebrated their birthdays and ignored mine. You pay for their classes and tell me to make my own decisions if I need anything. Sarah finally spoke, but her voice was no longer as confident. That's not what we meant. I laughed, and it didn't sound human, but rather like a sharp, almost cruel sound that seemed destined to shatter the silence that hung in the room. Yes, you did it. And you know what? It doesn't matter anymore because when you left me here, among these empty walls, when you didn't even bother to take me with you, you made one thing clear. I'm not part of this family. I'm not your daughter. I'm not your person. I don't owe anyone, and you don't owe me anything. So, Mom, Dad, Sarah, and Hannah, I'm sorry, but I don't owe you anything. Mom's eyes filled with tears, and I could see them rolling down her cheeks as the despair she'd once tried to hide now burst forth. Her face turned pale, but it didn't touch me. She reached out to me, as if trying to pull me back to the place where I'd once been her little girl, but I knew it was all empty. She spoke those words that sounded so banal and yet so deeply wrenching. Gloris, please. We've made mistakes, but we're still your family. We love you. Your tears mean nothing to me, I said coldly, with such indifference, as if this entire conversation had been nothing more than an exercise in hypocrisy. You should have thought about that before you decided I wasn't worth taking. I turned and walked to the front door, opening it as if to show that everything had already been decided, that there was no turning back for us. They were here in my house, but they still felt like strangers, and I felt like it was time to get rid of this intrusive presence. I think it's time for you to go, Gloris, Dad said, his voice shaking slightly, but there was no strength, no confidence, only weakness and confusion. Wait, he said, standing up. We can work this out. Now we can be a real family. I couldn't help but laugh, but it was restrained, bitter. No, we can't. You had 25 years to become a real family, but you chose not to. Now it's too late. As if on cue, one by one they began to leave the house, slowly, looking back, as if they couldn't believe it was truly the end. Mom was the last to leave and stopped at the door, turning to face me. There was something insistent in her gaze, but I no longer felt affection. I didn't know she was hoping for anything, but that no longer concerned me. It's not the end, Gloris. We won't refuse you. Yes, it's over, I replied, and the words were like a sharp blow that finally tore away the last of their place in my life. And if you keep bothering me, I'll get a restraining order. I closed the door and locked it. The sound was like release. From them, from their deception, from their clumsy attempts to manipulate my feelings. In the following weeks, they didn't leave me alone. My phone was constantly ringing off the hook with calls and messages. Deb left me several voicemails apologizing, promising they wanted to make things right, to make us a family again. Sarah sent long text messages about how she missed me and hoped we could get back to how things were before. Hannah, meanwhile, continued to ask for money for whatever she needed, without shame or regret. I ignored all of it. I wasn't just cold, I was deaf to them, as if they weren't people at all, just empty sounds that had nothing to do with me. After a while, they came to my house again. This time, I didn't even open the door. I simply informed them that if they didn't leave immediately, I would call the police and file for a restraining order. They finally realized I wasn't joking. At that moment, everything became clear. They couldn't interfere with my life anymore. They stopped bothering me. 6 months have passed since then. I live my own life. I live the way I want, and this feeling of freedom has been incredibly sweet. Jake and I have expanded our business and are now earning more than ever. I bought myself a new car, went on vacation to Europe, and am considering buying a beach house. A couple of days ago, Aunt Linda came to visit. She was always the peacemaker in the family, the one who tried to smooth over rough edges and mend broken threads. She sat down with me over a cup of coffee and said, "Gloris, dear, I think you should consider forgiving your parents. They know they made mistakes, and they really do want to make things right." I shook my head, feeling the old pain tightening inside me again. "I don't want to see them anymore," I replied, unsure how much strength there was in my words, but knowing I didn't want to return to that world of lies and manipulation. "Aunt Linda, I'm done with all of this." She looked sad but didn't insist. Before leaving, she hugged me. Her embrace was warm, but her words remained as gentle as ever. "I understand why you feel that way," she said. "I just hope that someday you'll be able to come to terms with this." I just nodded. I've already come to terms with it. I have a successful business, my own home, and real friends who truly care about me. I don't need people who only want to be around when I can do something for them. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd told them about my success from the start. Would they have treated me better? Would they have included me in their family affairs and vacations? Maybe. But I know one thing. It would have been fake, just like their tears when they asked me for money. They would have been kind to me only because I could give them something, not because they truly loved me. In fact, buying this house was the best decision of my life. Not only because now I have my own place to live, but also because it showed me who my family really is. She showed me that I was strong enough to stand up for myself and build my own life, and I didn't need anything else.